I want to welcome you, everyone who's joining us from away. I would like to first express our gratitude to the Okanagan First Nations, to the Silks people, who have demonstrated remarkable hospitality over multiple generations to those of us who arrived much later as strangers, and who were often bent on colonizing the land rather than recognizing it was already under the stewardship of those who understood it deeply. We are deeply grateful to be on this land and to have been welcomed by the Silks people. My guest and friend and also another associate professor at UBC Okanagan is George Grinnell, who is sitting beside me here, and we are going to talk about his book, The Social Life of Biometrics by George C. Grinnell. And I am Jennifer Gustar, and I'm an associate professor at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan, where I'm lucky enough to work with George Grinnell. There's something about it to me in the acknowledgments and also in the tone and the way you address quite complex theoretical topics, but the way you explain them very beautifully and accessibly. It seems to me that this is something of a personal project for you. It comes out of something quite personal that you wanted to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for those comments about the book. They mean a lot to me coming from a reader of your caliber, so I really appreciate that. I think it's a little bit of a funny project maybe to connect from what I do in the classroom to that particular book. But this is not really a book about technology as much as it's about how we exist in a world surrounded by technologies and what those technologies do to us. It's very much about how each of us are related to other people, right? That it's not just that I am who I am thanks to what I do in the world, thanks to what I think about in the world, but the ways in which we're shaped by other people. And so really what I'm trying to think about is how biometrics is related to a particular way of understanding ourselves. So biometrics can often be as simple as, using your finger thumbprint to open your phone, something like that. We obviously have, much more advanced biometric technology. People are often surprised to discover that despite the stories we tell about that technology, it's often not very effective, right? That,
I was surprised.
We have this kind of science fictional narrative about biometrics.
Society of surveillance. Yeah.
Right, absolutely. And there is that out there, but a lot of that technology doesn't work especially well yet, and it's not nearly as pervasive as we think. But this book is really about something else. It's about the ways in which biometric technology has a much older history than what we think of. It really isn't something that we've created in the past 20 to 25 years. It's something that we've been living with for 200 years at least.
Right.
And it really shapes how we understand ourselves. So biometric technology seems to think that I am equivalent to my body. And so to go back to that comment you made about the acknowledgements, one of the things I'm trying to do there is to acknowledge that I'm not just who I am as a individual person. I'm shaped by much larger social, individual, familial relations there. And so in this book, I'm trying to think about how biometrics shapes a certain way of thinking. Right, and that's the hardest, I think, feature perhaps that I'm trying to convey with this particular book. It's not really that I'm worried all that much, to be honest, about biometrics, but I'm worried about how they condition how we think. Right, they shape us to start to think in a certain fashion.
This is an interdisciplinary undertaking, and you do some wonderful things with different types of stories. And I want to talk about that too a little bit, how you draw on the real life experience of people at various types of borders, and then how you move into literature and literature of the 19th century, and also current literature. So I do want to talk about how you meld or work between these very different kind of disciplinary areas. It really works beautifully, and it's a very good example of some of the things we're trying to do with our work. Yeah.
It was a really fascinating project to try to conceive in that way, because I think I wrote this in a way that is really different from anything I'd written before, and I like it a lot more in a sense. And so I let myself run with the ideas first and not worry so much about how I was going to embed those in a particular archive. And I think that opening chapter that you mentioned, where I offer a series of individual accounts, where I just run through a number of short narrative examples of here's an individual encountering a particular biometric reality, a particular practice that's shaped in some way by biometrics. That came to me quite late, but I think it's really at the heart of the book and what I'm trying to do, because I'm trying to think about how people actually live in this reality and what that looks like. And then working with literature is an obvious sort of happy place for me. That's what I know how to do. But in many ways, the project started now probably about 15 years ago, researching in the Romantic period and finding out about this pseudoscience of physiognomy, this notion of face reading. And that was the genesis for all of this work, because I started to recognize that 200 years ago, we were already thinking about biometrics. We were already trying to read individuals whom we didn't know, and we were concerned about not knowing who they were. And to my mind, that's still the kind of primary purpose of what we have biometrics doing. They offer this kind of social palliative, I don't know who this person is who's arriving at the border. Isn't there some way that we can make them less strange, that we can be sure we know who they are? And if what we're doing is arriving at an institutional verification of their official identity, that's useful up to a point, but we shouldn't confuse that with actually understanding who someone is, right? And it's that action that concerns me, because in actual fact, what's happening is we're not seeing who they are. And the problem that I keep trying to put my finger on in the book is that what happens, especially at the border, when we try to identify someone biometrically. I was thinking when I was writing this book in 2015, in particular, about the massive migration out of Syria at that moment in time. And we were reassured by our Prime Minister that the individuals that scant 25,000 refugees that we were going to admit into Canada would be biometrically assessed at the border, right? As if that meant something to us.
Yeah. And the thing is that we probably were inclined to think that did mean something until we examine what biometrics really can do, which is very little, really.
Right, it's very little, and yet it's also so substantially distracting, because what happens is we start to focus on those individuals who arrive at the border, and we don't see everything else, right? And that's the painful reality, to my mind, that the book is really trying to address here, is that we narrow things down so that we only see people, and we don't see the context that surrounds them. We don't see what led them to that border in the first place. And to my mind, to give the example of Canada in 2015, we were dropping bombs in Syria as if that was going to solve an intractable civil war in that country. All we were doing was displacing people, and then we pat ourselves on the back for welcoming in 25,000 refugees.
And kind of hospitality.
Right,
really.
we weren't having the conversation we needed to have, which is that we were directly responsible for that displacement of people. We had a responsibility to those individuals. And so when biometrics looks at a person, they only see the person and they miss everything else. And that's my concern, is that we start to lose all of that context.
Right, and also talk about space and land and place. Where they are going is not the issue. They are leaving for their lives, and that they have a need to be recognized within the context of their arrival here or there, and in the context of the lands that they love but must leave for the sake of their families. It's a very complex thing that we occlude and displace when we watch them come across the border and stamp their passport with a welcome or not welcome based on a bit of biometric data.
And we have this way, people who look like me in Canada expect someone arriving from elsewhere to be
Profoundly grateful.
Profoundly grateful, right? To arrive here and feel nothing but gratitude for their new home because they've made it to somewhere that is better to live. And it's like, no, that's just not the reality. And so in this book, I'm trying to think about those sorts of ways of understanding migration as well.
One of the stories you talk about, the contemporary one from the Yuri Herrera.
In Yuri Herrera's Signs Preceding the End of the World, he's trying to offer up a really conventional scene of migration, right? One that gets so much press and publicity in the United States right now. Herrera has this wonderful phrase. He talks about versing. It's this notion that people aren't going to somewhere, right? And that's part of what I was reflecting on in thinking about that subject who is supposed to be gracious, that individual who is supposed to appreciate being in Canada. The migrant who verses is moving. They're not arriving somewhere. They're not going from somewhere worse to somewhere better. They're just simply moving, right? If human history shows us nothing else, it shows us that we are a migratory people.
Absolutely.
We move around.
Yes.
And obviously we move around in new and different ways. The history of colonialism is a particular form of human movement. Right? So this isn't always a good thing, to be sure.
Yeah.
But Herrera gives us this way of thinking about versing that I think really unsettles the kind of moral logic of movement there, that we can just sort of imagine individuals who move through space. They're not necessarily departing from somewhere or arriving to somewhere. They're simply interested in moving. And so I'm trying to think about identity as something that is attached to a particular context, maybe attached to a particular land, and maybe that's a land one is moving to, a land one is moving from, and that there isn't necessarily an essence there. And so I'm trying to really tease out another way of thinking about identity that is maybe much more mobile.
Identity is understood by people as something we're born with. The cogency of your argument is the way in which it is really able to make us see that our identity is relational rather than just something that we pull out of our bones.
I wanted to look at all of this mode of thinking, this, this set of social habits, as you say, that emerge and are, I think, authorized, encouraged, made possible through biometrics there. And so
and hung into modernity, really.
Right, absolutely. And so I go back to physiognomy in the Romantic period and this notion that individuals were going to wander through the streets of London and whip out their pocket lavender. It was Johann Caspar Lavater, Swiss pseudoscientist, who invented this notion that, you could study my eyebrows, the set of my cheeks, or my jawline, and all of a sudden learn something about me. Know that, like, oh, you don't want to trust that guy, right? Watch out for him. And so it was this fantasy that you were going to read people as if they were books.
And so countered by Frankenstein, by Mary Shelley's A Brilliant Book.
Right, absolutely. And that was a big part of it, and a big part of the argument to my mind is that we've always had other ways of thinking about this, right? Yeah, from the very beginning. This. And so I really worry when we get drawn into these sorts of modes of thought, and it's really not a different way of understanding one another than what we see from forms of racism, forms of sexism, homophobia, etc. These are all fantasies that involve imagining we know someone based on how they appear to us. And it feels so impersonal, the way we encounter biometric technology. And what I think is so striking and maybe misguided then as a result is that we imagine that we do individually control our identities, and that biometrics is somehow taking our identity outside of us. It's transforming me into data, and that's terrifying, right? It's the kind of common sense everyday anxiety that I know I have, maybe I'm just strange, whenever I cross the border. And I'm like, I have nothing to hide, right? I don't have anything shady in my suitcase, but still I'm anxious about somehow proving who I am to this official when there's really nothing to prove, but that anxiety reflects the fact that I'm having to submit to a process that I don't really control. And so the reality is that my identity isn't something that I do control, right? It's that fantasy that's at the root of the anxiety. It's that notion that somehow at the moment of biometric inspection, I've lost control of who I am. I'm trying to think a different way that says, I never get to control exactly who I am, right? That it's always something bigger than me. It's always a set of circumstances, a set of realities that I didn't choose, I didn't author. And so someone like Judith Butler is so good on this point, where she helps us to understand that whoever I am, part of who I am, is that I'm someone who identifies as male. And that's not a reality I have any say in. I can play around with that, right? I can do what I can do within it, but there's a social life to maleness.
Right. You can expose it, you can critique it, but you're still abiding in it somehow. George made me see for the first time, I think, or more clearly, how I am in a relationship of a guest with a host, and that really hit home because of your book, that our identities are built through recognition. So in recognizing the needs, the demands, the place and the space of another, we are being called upon to show hospitality. But we, the settlers, have already been shown that hospitality. You write that any idea of the public here must acknowledge the Silks people's remarkable hospitality to those who for generations have sought to destroy and displace them and their culture. And you go on to say, this means that when we use a language of hospitality that sees some as hosts to asylum-seeking foreigners, it is a mode of thought that can exclude an awareness of the guest-host relations already in operation here. Erasing then from public memory the historical theft of unceded Indigenous land that has made some so prosperous. Gave me insight into more insight than I have had before into what it means to be a settler on the land of the Silks people, and what that relation of recognition must be.
You know, and in the last chapter, I'm trying to think about hospitality as one framework that offers an alternative to what we get from biometric thought, which is this kind of relentless identification of individuals. And it strikes me that hospitality, if it's thought rigorously, makes a different kind of demand upon us. It asks us to consider not just who are you when you arrive on our doorsteps, but instead, and this is a question that I draw from David Simpson's analysis of Wordsworth, in a poem in which Wordsworth poses the question, not who are you, but how do you live, right? And so hospitality asks that question, right? It's as if to say, what do you need? How can I help, almost?
To live the way
it doesn't,
you live.
right? To live a livable life. And so I'm trying to think about that, but it also demands that we don't presume in a country like ours that I have the right alone or exclusively, or maybe even, period, that I have the right to be the one to pose that question, how do you live, to another, to extend some sort of gracious hospitality to another, but instead to recognize that I too am a migrant who has arrived here. I too am a settler who has arrived here, who's part of a particular history. Again, we've got to see more than the person, right? We've got to see that I'm not just me arriving here. I didn't arrive here with any ill intent. I didn't arrive here with a desire to continue the legacy of colonialism, but it's precisely that legacy that made it possible for me to arrive here, right? And so I have to own that history. I have to be part of decolonizing that history as much as I possibly can. And so within this context, that means I can't presume to be the one who gets to name myself host, right? That's not a privilege, that's not a position that I can claim there. And so in that last chapter, I'm really just trying to open up that question of hospitality in a way that doesn't make anything easier, right? And that's what I think is so important about it. This isn't a solution, but rather this is a new set of problems so that we can start maybe asking the right set of questions. and we can start to think differently about this. And that's what I love about literature as one of the sources for this particular work, is this is always going to be about the imagination. We've got to think differently than we've been thinking so far. We've been led down a particular way of thought. And I think we urgently need a different way of thinking, especially in a world where so many get displaced, where so many are migrating, not by choice, not by desire necessarily, but by force.
Yes. It's ethics, study of technology, study of literature, beautifully wedded together. It's really, really an enjoyable read, and I think accessible. Thanks, George.
Thank you so much.
It's so great seeing you. And but the social life of biometrics, and don't let it scare you like it scared me with the title, because it's accessible. It tells us wonderful stories of who we are, and how to negotiate who we are, and especially how to negotiate with others. So yeah, I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed being with you guys. Thanks, Joanne, Shona, and thank you and for being in my rose garden.